Eleanor Hughes had long since mastered the art of stillness. From the manicure hedgerows lining their Surrey estate to the daily rituals she upheld with quiet grace, her life was a study in controlled elegance. In her early 40s, she had the kind of composure that made others instinctively lower their voices in her presence. It was not haughtiness, but a quiet authority that had taken shape over 15 years of marriage, motherhood, and managing a life designed more for her husband's ambition than her own. Their home, a handsome Georgian manor tucked behind a row of ancient oaks, reflected that same sense of precision. Eleanor ensured it remained immaculate not just in appearance but in spirit, a place where tradition held firm, and expectations were met without fuss. Thomas Hughes, her husband, had once called her his greatest asset. He had meant it as a compliment. She'd smiled at the time, not quite realizing the weight of the word. Thomas was the sort of man who dominated any room. Tall, polished, effortlessly charismatic. Over the years, he'd built a reputation in London's financial circles as a sharp strategist with a Midas touch. He could sell sand to the Saudis, his colleagues often joked. Eleanor, meanwhile, remained behind the scenes, hosting dinner parties, managing the household, attending school functions for their children, Alice and Henry, and keeping Thomas grounded. Or so she'd believed. But recently, something had shifted. At first, it was small things: Thomas canceling family dinners last minute, a new password on his laptop, phone calls that ended abruptly when she walked into the room. He was still attentive in public, charming, even, but in private, a quiet frost had taken hold between them. There were nights he didn't come home, claiming late meetings or overnight travel. She had confronted him gently once, only to be met with an exasperated smile and a pat on the shoulder. "You're imagining things, Ellie." She wasn't. Eleanor was not the sort of woman who jumped to conclusions. Her mind worked like a chessboard, each move considered, consequences weighed. But the more she observed, the clearer it became: Thomas was hiding something. There was a distance in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a sharpness in his voice that seemed to surface even in mundane conversation. Something was coming. She could feel it in the tightening of her chest when he walked into the room and barely acknowledged her. Still, she said nothing. Not yet. Not until she understood the game being played. One quiet Sunday morning in March, the air in Surrey was cool and heavy with mist. Eleanor was arranging daffodils in a vase when Thomas entered the kitchen, still in his dressing gown. He poured himself a cup of coffee, sat at the breakfast bar, and watched her for a moment before speaking. "I'd like us to host the family next weekend," he said casually. "Here." Sunday afternoon. She turned, eyebrows raised. "For what occasion?" "There's something I'd like to share," he said, taking a sip. "Something important. It's time everyone hears it." Eleanor studied him. There was a flicker of something unreadable in his expression, anticipation, perhaps, or nerves. He was good at masking his intentions, but not flawless. "Not to her." "Everyone?" she asked. "Yes. The children, my parents. Your sister as well. I know she'll want to be here." Eleanor nodded slowly, placing the vase on the table. Her hands lingered at the rim, adjusting a stem. "Very well," she said. "I'll prepare something proper. Nothing too fancy," he added quickly. "Just simple. Relaxed." That was when she knew. Eleanor had hosted dozens of family gatherings over the years. Birthdays, holidays, anniversaries. Thomas always insisted on formalities: champagne on arrival, 3 courses, the best china. His request for something relaxed wasn't just out of character, it was calculated. He wanted the gathering to feel spontaneous, informal, as though the announcement to come would be a natural, offhand revelation. She gave a small nod and turned away, pretending to tidy a drawer. Her mind, however, had already begun to churn. What was he about to reveal? A new business venture? An overseas move? But her heart whispered the truth she had tried not to name: he was leaving her. The days that followed passed in strange silence. Eleanor went through the motions of life with a mechanical grace, planning the menu, confirming with family, arranging the seating. She kept her voice light on the phone with her sister, Charlotte, who cheerfully accepted the invitation with no idea of what lay ahead. The children, caught in their teenage whirlwinds, were indifferent to the sudden family event. Only Alice, 15 and sharper than she let on, eyed her mother curiously. "Everything all right?" she asked one evening, her voice low as they loaded the dishwasher together. "Of course," Eleanor replied, placing a glass carefully on the rack. "Why wouldn't it be?" Alice shrugged but didn't press. Eleanor made a mental note to check in with her later, once the dust had settled. If it ever did. The morning of the gathering arrived gray and still. Eleanor stood in the garden just after 7 o'clock, breathing in the damp earth and dew-heavy air. The table was set. The roast was in the oven. Champagne was chilling in the butler's pantry, habit, not hope. She wore a navy dress with clean lines, her hair swept back in a low twist. She looked, to the outside world, every inch the serene hostess. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the house was full. Thomas's parents arrived first, his mother bringing a bottle of red wine Eleanor would quietly store and forget. Charlotte arrived next, trailing conversation and her usual frank charm. The children hovered in the sitting room, exchanging awkward greetings and sneaking glances at their phones. When Thomas finally entered the room, dressed immaculately in a gray suit despite the casual setting, Eleanor knew it was time. He moved to the center of the room, clearing his throat, a practiced calm in his voice. "I want to thank you all for coming," he began, his eyes scanning the room. "There's something Eleanor and I need to share." She felt her breath catch, not from shock, but from the sheer audacity of his opening line. "Eleanor and I." He was staging this like a joint decision, a united front. She folded her hands in her lap and looked up at him, waiting. Thomas smiled faintly and took a deep breath. "We've decided to separate." The words landed with a silence so dense it seemed to muffle the very walls. Alice gasped. Charlotte sat up straighter. His father's mouth opened slightly. Eleanor, however, did not move. Thomas turned to her, expecting something. Tears, perhaps. A nod of agreement. Maybe even anger. But Eleanor remained still. And then, slowly, she smiled. Not kindly. Not cruelly. Just, knowingly. The room braced itself, not yet realizing that the real announcement had yet to come. The silence in the room was thick and unnatural, as though even the walls were holding their breath. Thomas stood with a posture too straight, like he'd practiced it in front of a mirror. His gaze remained locked on the fireplace, deliberately avoiding Eleanor's face. His words still echoed faintly, but no one had moved. Not his parents, who sat wide-eyed on the settee. Not his children, who looked back and forth between their parents like spectators at a match they hadn't realized they were watching. Not even Charlotte, who usually had something to say about everything, but now sat in complete, stunned disbelief. Eleanor remained perfectly still, her expression unreadable. She let the moment stretch, the tension rise like a tide pulling at the furniture. She could feel all their eyes turning towards her, as though waiting for the cue to cry, to shout, to collapse. But she did none of those things. Instead, she reached forward and picked up her glass of elderflower cordial from the side table. She sipped it slowly, watching Thomas. The clink of ice was the only sound in the room. "Is that it?" Charlotte finally asked, her voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. Thomas cleared his throat. "Yes. That's the announcement. Eleanor and I have had ongoing discussions, and we've agreed that this is what's best for both of us." The way he said it, so formal, so polished, it felt rehearsed, like a press release. But Eleanor had not agreed. There had been no discussions. No explanations. Just this carefully choreographed ambush in their own living room. She set the glass down gently and stood up. The movement was so fluid, so controlled, that it startled no one but demanded everyone's attention. She walked slowly to the center of the room, where Thomas stood. He took a slight step back, barely perceptible to anyone else, but to Eleanor, it said everything. She turned to the others, her voice calm and clear. "Thank you all for coming. I realize this has come as a shock to most of you. It certainly did to me." Thomas's jaw twitched. "But since Thomas has chosen to share news that affects our family, I think it's only fair that I share something of my own." Thomas glanced at her, a flicker of confusion tightening his brow. He had not anticipated this. That alone gave her strength. "I wasn't planning to say this today," she continued. "I'd hoped to discuss it privately. But since we're being transparent," she reached behind the armchair and lifted a slim leather briefcase she had tucked away before the gathering began. She opened it slowly and pulled out a folder, then faced the group again. "I recently made an investment," she said. "One that turned out to be rather fruitful. Effective immediately, I am the majority shareholder of Hughes Strategic Group." The room shifted. It wasn't movement, it was energy. The change was immediate and electric. Charlotte's hand flew to her mouth. Thomas's mother audibly gasped. Henry whispered, "What?" under his breath. Only Alice remained completely still, her eyes locked on her mother's face. Thomas blinked. What are you talking about?" Eleanor didn't look at him. She opened the folder and withdrew several documents, holding them up with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "These," she said, "are the share purchase agreements. Fully signed, dated, and filed. As of last Thursday, I now hold 52% of Hughes Strategic Group." Thomas took a step toward her, voice rising. "That's not possible. That's Eleanor, that's not how this works. You can't just walk in, Anne." "I didn't walk in," she replied, turning to face him. "I spent months acquiring those shares. Legally. Quietly. While you were busy planning this little performance." The color drained from his face. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Eleanor turned back to the others. "For those unfamiliar, Hughes Strategic Group has been facing some internal turbulence. Several investors were pulling out. Thomas was, I believe, attempting to stabilize the situation. Unfortunately, he didn't anticipate someone else stepping in." "You've gone mad," Thomas said, his voice now laced with panic. Charlotte stood up. "Wait. Eleanor, are you serious? You own the company now?" "Yes," she answered, without hesitation. "And I didn't intend to say anything yet. But if Thomas has decided to redefine our relationship in front of everyone, I thought it only right to clarify the professional one as well." His father looked bewildered. "But, why would you do this, Eleanor?" "Because I had no other choice," she replied, her voice steady. "Thomas was preparing to divorce me, likely trying to separate our finances quietly beforehand. I discovered his intentions by accident. So I made some arrangements of my own." Thomas's voice cracked as he stepped forward. "You've gone behind my back. You've destroyed everything." Eleanor turned to him fully. "No, Thomas. You destroyed it. I simply picked up the pieces before they were scattered." He looked ready to say something else, but then stopped. His hands trembled slightly. The expression on his face wasn't anger, it was fear. For the first time in their marriage, he was on the back foot. And he didn't know how to recover. The room erupted into overlapping voices, Charlotte trying to understand what had just unfolded, the children asking questions Eleanor couldn't yet answer, Thomas's parents murmuring to each other in confusion. Through it all, Eleanor remained calm, her documents still in hand, her gaze focused only on what came next. "Are you going to fire him?" Henry asked suddenly, voice cracking with uncertainty. Eleanor knelt in front of her son. "No, sweetheart," she said gently. "That's not how this works. But there will be changes. Some that needed to happen a long time ago." Alice stepped closer. "Mom, did you know this was coming?" Eleanor nodded. "Not everything. But I knew enough to be ready." Thomas finally moved, walking out of the sitting room and into the hallway. Eleanor heard the back door open, then close. He had fled the scene of his own grand performance. Charlotte exhaled. Bloody hell, Elle. You just turned the whole thing upside down. Eleanor managed a thin smile. Yes. I suppose I did. But even as she stood among her stunned family, Eleanor knew this was only the beginning. Thomas wasn't the type to walk away quietly. He would regroup, retaliate. She had exposed him in the one arena he couldn't bear to lose, control. And yet, as she looked around at the faces still processing what had happened, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Certainty. She had stepped out of his shadow, and he had no idea how to block the sun now. In the quiet that followed, Eleanor gathered the documents, carefully placed them back in the briefcase, and looked toward the doorway where Thomas had disappeared. The storm had begun. But she had brought her own thunder. The door had barely closed behind Thomas when Eleanor felt the weight of every eye still fixed on her. For a moment, it was as though the room were caught between breaths, unsure whether to speak, shout, or simply stand there in disbelief. The briefcase remained beside her, unopened now, but its presence alone felt like a declaration that echoed louder than any words Thomas had spoken that day. She walked back to her chair slowly, deliberately. The aura of control surrounding her was no accident. It had been cultivated, nurtured, and sharpened in silence. And now it had become armor. Charlotte was the first to speak again. She remained standing, staring at Eleanor with an expression somewhere between shock and admiration. You planned this. Not just today, this whole thing. You've been preparing. Eleanor met her gaze without hesitation. I had to. Once I saw what Thomas was trying to do, I couldn't sit back and wait for him to finish the job. But how? Charlotte asked. How did you even get enough shares? He built that company from nothing. You weren't even on the board. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Thomas assumed that because I wasn't in the room, I wasn't paying attention. That was his first mistake. Henry sat frozen on the edge of the armchair, still processing the rapid shift in dynamics. Mom, does this mean you're his boss now? Eleanor let out a soft, almost ironic breath. In corporate terms, yes. But this isn't about revenge, Henry. It's about protecting what he would have destroyed. Alice remained near the doorway, arms folded. Her face was more thoughtful than upset. He looked like he had no idea. Like you hit him out of nowhere. That's because he never thought I could, Eleanor said, the calm in her voice cutting deeper than any raised tone. He's built an entire life around the illusion that control equals loyalty. He never once imagined I had power of my own. Thomas's mother, who had remained eerily silent throughout, finally spoke, her voice trembling. Eleanor, this is all very unexpected. Surely there must be a way for you two to resolve this privately. The children. The children, Eleanor interrupted, now looking squarely at her in-laws, have watched their father distance himself from this family for over a year. They've seen him lie, hide, and manipulate. What I did today wasn't just for me. It was for them too. Charlotte rubbed her temples. You're scaring the hell out of me, Elle. But I have to say, this is the most alive I've seen you in years. That struck a chord. Eleanor looked down at her hands, the very ones that had prepared countless dinners, written school notes, packed bags, signed checks, all for a life that had slowly become invisible. I forgot who I was, she admitted. I let myself believe that supporting him meant disappearing. And then I found that contract. She hadn't planned to mention it. Not yet. But the words slipped out like a thread being pulled from a tightly wound fabric. What contract? Charlotte asked, eyes narrowing. Eleanor hesitated, then stood again, walking toward the fireplace mantel where a small ceramic box sat. She opened it and withdrew a folded sheet of paper. She handed it to her sister. Charlotte read quickly, then looked up with a mixture of fury and disbelief. He drafted a legal separation behind your back. Found it in his office. Hidden under a fake name folder. It was weeks old. Everyone in the room now realized the full scope of what Eleanor had endured before arriving at this moment. Her act had not been born of impulse, it was a calculated response to quiet betrayal. Thomas's father looked pale, eyes darting between Eleanor and the paper in Charlotte's hand. "Why didn't you come to us?" "Because I needed time," Eleanor replied. "Time to think, to plan, to ensure that when he tried to cut me out of the life I helped build, he'd find the door locked behind him." Alice stepped closer, her voice careful. "Does this mean you'll be taking over everything?" Eleanor turned to her daughter and placed a hand on her shoulder. "It means I'll be protecting what's left. I'm not here to destroy him. But I won't let him take everything while pretending he's the victim." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car engine outside. Thomas hadn't driven far, apparently. Eleanor moved to the front window and watched as his sleek black Mercedes disappeared down the long driveway. He hadn't returned, only driven away. Charlotte folded the legal document and placed it back on the mantel. "He'll retaliate, you know. Men like him don't lose gracefully." "I'm counting on that," Eleanor replied. The rest of the afternoon passed in fragments. The guests slowly departed, still reeling from the dual shock. Charlotte lingered the longest, helping Eleanor clear the remnants of what was supposed to be a pleasant family lunch. As they washed glasses together in the kitchen, Charlotte glanced at her. "Do you think you'll be all right?" Eleanor looked out the window at the mist settling over the back garden. "I'm not sure. But I know this, I'm not afraid of him anymore." Charlotte placed a glass on the drying rack and smirked. "Good. Because you just declared war." That evening, after the house had emptied and the children retreated to their rooms with the heaviness of reality still clinging to their thoughts, Eleanor sat in her study. The documents were back in her briefcase. Her laptop open, emails already pouring in. News had traveled quickly. Her name was now on record. The majority shareholder. Not the silent wife, not the accessory. The chairwoman. A new nameplate was already being prepared for Monday's board meeting. She leaned back in the leather chair and allowed herself a single moment of reflection. The fight ahead would be brutal. Thomas would not fade quietly. But the path had already been chosen. This wasn't about proving something to him. It was about remembering who she was before she had been told to be smaller, quieter, easier to manage. She switched off the desk lamp and closed her laptop. He had made his announcement. Now she was making hers. And this was only the beginning. It had started with a text message. 3 months before the family gathering, Eleanor had been ironing one of Thomas's shirts when his phone lit up on the hallway console. The message was brief and vague, from a name she didn't recognize, meeting confirmed. Same location. She hadn't meant to read it. She wasn't the sort to snoop. But something in the wording made her pause. Not because of jealousy, Thomas had long since drifted into emotional obscurity, but because it confirmed a pattern she had been tracking silently for weeks. That text was followed by a curious withdrawal on their shared account, £4,000, marked simply as consultancy. 2 days later, Thomas returned home later than usual, claiming the train had been delayed by a signal failure outside Clapham Junction. It was a credible excuse, but Eleanor checked the transport reports anyway. There had been no such delay that day. She didn't confront him. Not then. Instead, she began keeping notes. Eleanor created a document on her personal laptop, tucked away beneath innocuous folders labeled garden plans and holiday recipes. In it, she recorded discrepancies, changes in his behavior, and unexplained gaps in time. She copied bank statements and archived screenshots of unusual emails. The picture formed slowly, like a puzzle laid out with deliberate care. Thomas's routines were changing, subtly, but consistently. Where once he had shared details of board meetings and business trips, now he spoke in vague terms. He had grown irritable, quick to dismiss even the most benign questions. "It's just work, Ellie. You wouldn't understand." The real fracture came when Eleanor found the contract. She hadn't meant to be in his study at all that evening. Thomas had left behind a shopping list in the side pocket of his briefcase, and she'd gone in to retrieve it. While searching, she noticed a black folder that had no business being there. No label. Slightly too new. Tucked behind a row of untouched annual reports. Her curiosity outweighed her caution. Inside were draft documents from a solicitor's office in London, property disclosures, financial disclosures, a proposed timeline. Everything was drafted in his name alone. No joint consultation. No conversation. Just a tidy, premeditated separation agreement. It wasn't the legal language that hurt. It was the finality of it. The dates suggested he had begun consulting the solicitor nearly 2 months before she saw the file. All that time, he had kissed her cheek in the morning and thanked her for dinner at night. And all the while, he had been preparing his exit. Eleanor didn't cry. Not even after reading the document a second time. She simply closed the folder, replaced it exactly where she'd found it, and left the room. But that night, while Thomas slept beside her, she stared at the ceiling for hours, her mind spiraling through every quiet moment she had dismissed as ordinary. By morning, she had made a decision. She would not confront him. Not yet. Instead, she would pull the thread and follow wherever it led. She called Charlotte under the guise of checking on a birthday present for their niece. As they chatted, Eleanor steered the conversation toward university memories, casually asking if Charlotte remembered Julian Wren, the barrister who had once dated one of their flatmates. "Oh, Julian?" Charlotte said. "He's some high-flying corporate lawyer now. Last I heard, he deals with company acquisitions and shareholder negotiations. Lives in Knightsbridge." Eleanor filed the name away and sent him an email that evening under her maiden name. The reply came within the hour. They met in a quiet corner of a private members' club 2 days later. Julian looked exactly as she remembered, polished, precise, but with a glint of amusement in his eye that made him instantly approachable. After some pleasantries, she handed him a copy of the draft separation agreement and said only, "I believe my husband is preparing to divest me of more than just a marriage." Julian raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He read through the document with quick, methodical eyes. "He's planning to file soon," he said. "But what exactly do you want from me, Eleanor?" She folded her hands on the table. "I want to understand my options. Not just personally, but professionally. I believe his company is vulnerable. I want to know if that's true." That began a cascade of discreet investigations. Julian and his firm began quietly monitoring the structure of Hughes Strategic Group. He accessed public shareholder records, spoke with his network of contacts in the investment world, and discovered what Thomas had tried so hard to conceal, a steady erosion of trust behind the boardroom doors. Several minority shareholders had recently liquidated their positions. A potential partnership deal had fallen through. The firm's Q4 forecast was overly optimistic, and auditors had quietly flagged inconsistencies that hadn't reached the public eye. Eleanor absorbed every detail. At night, while Thomas slept or stayed out late claiming business dinners, she sat at her desk with a legal pad, drafting questions, studying ownership breakdowns, highlighting names of stakeholders. It became clear that Thomas's company was not the fortress he made it appear to be. It was hollowing from the inside, and his charm no longer masked the rot. Julian identified a potential opening, a group of mid-level shareholders looking to offload their stake. Nothing substantial on its own, but if bought collectively, and quickly, it would amount to just over 30% of the company. Still not a controlling interest, Julian had warned. But it's a foothold. "I'll take it," Eleanor replied without hesitation. She created a shell entity through Julian's firm. All purchases were routed through it, leaving no traceable link to her name. She used a combination of dormant trust accounts, family inheritance, and discreet funding through her personal savings, money Thomas never paid attention to because he assumed she had no reason to spend. Every acquisition was handled with surgical precision. No headlines. No alerts. Within 5 weeks, Eleanor controlled 32% of Hughes Strategic Group. The next opportunity came when an early investor, a former university peer of Thomas's who had fallen on hard times, offered up his shares in a quiet email auction. Julian flagged the listing within hours. Eleanor placed the winning bid. 45%. One more shareholder caved under market pressure just days before the family gathering. With a final purchase, Eleanor crossed the threshold. 52%. Majority ownership. And yet, she told no one. Not even Charlotte. She stored the signed documents in her briefcase, waiting. Watching. Because Eleanor knew Thomas. He wasn't just planning to leave her, he was planning to make her invisible. She would not let him. By the time he asked for the family to gather, Eleanor was ready. He had written a script. She had rewritten the ending. The first meeting with Julian had marked the beginning of Eleanor's silent campaign. But it was during their third meeting, inside a discreet glass office overlooking Lincoln's Inn Fields, that her strategy began to crystallize into something tangible. Julian, sleeves rolled up, had just walked her through a simplified flowchart of shareholder classes within Hughes' strategic group, when Eleanor pointed to one corner of the chart and asked, "Who are they?" He adjusted his glasses. "Those are silent stakeholders, non-voting shares issued early in the company's growth. Mostly passive investors. Many are likely unaware they still hold value, or they're content letting the shares sit idle." Eleanor leaned forward. "Can they be bought?" "They can. But many of them aren't on the open market. You'd need to contact them directly." "Let's start with those," she said. The decision was bold, but calculated. Eleanor had no intention of waiting for opportunity to knock. She would go to the door, swing it open, and invite opportunity to the table. Julian connected her with a small team of corporate analysts who began discreet outreach. Their goal was simple: identify passive investors willing to sell, ensure the anonymity of the buyer, and secure contracts before Thomas or his board caught wind. The challenge wasn't just strategic, it was also psychological. Eleanor was venturing into a world she had once viewed from a distance, usually as a hostess at fundraisers or a silent observer during business dinners. But with every negotiation, with every paper she signed, she felt her footing grow steadier. She used her maiden name in all dealings. The accounts were routed through an independent legal trust. Julian taught her how to speak in percentages, how to ask questions that revealed more than they appeared to, and how to sense hesitation in a seller's voice. One by one, the pieces moved into place. But not everything went smoothly. One of the shareholders, a reclusive widow who held 2% of the company's shares, insisted on meeting in person. Eleanor drove 3 hours to Devon to sit with the woman in a conservatory filled with porcelain cats and heavy curtains. She drank over-sugared tea, listened to long-winded stories about a late husband, and carefully directed the conversation back to business. "She always said Thomas had charm," the woman remarked, peering at Eleanor over a flowery teacup. "But I never trusted charm, dear. That boy always looked like he was selling something. Sometimes I think he forgot to believe in what he sold." Eleanor didn't comment. She only smiled. When the papers were signed, the woman reached for her hand. "I hope you're doing this for the right reasons." "I am," Eleanor said quietly. "I'm doing it for everyone he's forgotten." With that acquisition, Eleanor reached 47%. But the final push required more than charm or patience, it required leverage. A junior analyst at Hughes' strategic group, whom Eleanor had met once at a company event and remembered by name, appeared on Julian's radar. He had recently left the firm under vague terms but still maintained contact with several staff members and had insider knowledge of share movements and investor concerns. Julian reached out under the guise of general industry recruitment. The analyst, Simon Marks, agreed to a meeting. Eleanor attended, this time without Julian, choosing to speak directly and honestly. Simon, a young man in his early 30s with a cautious air, was hesitant at first. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "You're not a corporate raider. You're his wife." Soon-to-be ex-wife, Eleanor corrected. "And I'm not here to tear down the company. I'm here to save what he's been letting rot." He studied her for a long moment before responding. "There's one investor he's been trying to win back. If you beat him to it, you'll secure the final block." "Who?" Simon handed her a name, Gavin Ashford. a former partner of Thomas's who had left the board 3 years ago after a public disagreement over a failed expansion strategy. Eleanor remembered him vaguely, a stern man with sharp eyes and a taste for minimal conversation. He now lived in Bath. Eleanor arranged a lunch under pretext, having Julian contact him through a mutual acquaintance. Gavin agreed, reluctantly. The meeting was brief. Gavin wasn't interested in small talk. He asked only one question before allowing Eleanor to make her case. "Do you want revenge or stability?" "Stability," she answered. "Then tell me what you know about the company's current cash flow." She did. In detail. Enough that Gavin leaned back, impressed. "Most people think Thomas is still the genius behind this firm," Gavin said, folding his arms. "But his best ideas dried up 3 years ago. The rest has been smoke and mirrors." "Which is why I need to take control," Eleanor replied. "Before the illusion becomes irreversible." He sold. 2 days later, Eleanor crossed the 50% threshold. It was only after the contracts were finalized, the legal filings complete, and the financials settled, that Eleanor allowed herself a single evening of reflection. She sat in her study with a folder of documents and opened a bottle of red wine, a vintage Thomas had once reserved for a client dinner she wasn't invited to. She sipped it slowly, letting the quiet of the room settle around her. It wasn't celebration she felt, it was clarity. For years, she had supported his dreams, buffered his moods, kept the family structure intact while he chased deals and headlines. Now, she had built something of her own. Not just shares on a spreadsheet, but a position of influence forged through determination and resolve. She received a text message from Julian that night, "We're ready whenever you are." Her response was brief, "Sunday." That Sunday, when Thomas stood before the family and declared the end of their marriage, Eleanor had already rehearsed her words in her mind. Not the tone of revenge, but of certainty. When she revealed her ownership, when she handed over the documents with steady hands and looked him in the eye, she wasn't just disrupting his narrative, she was rewriting it entirely. Because power, she had learned, wasn't loud. It was deliberate. It was earned. And now, it was hers. The morning after the family gathering, the house in Surrey was unusually still. Eleanor rose early, made her tea, and stood by the kitchen window, watching the trees sway in the soft morning wind. The dining room had been cleared the night before, though the silence still held the echoes of interrupted speeches and stunned expressions. The weight of what had unfolded hadn't lifted, not yet, but Eleanor moved through the quiet like someone acclimating to new altitude, aware that the air was thinner, but not yet short of breath. She was halfway through her tea when she heard the door open. Thomas stepped into the kitchen without a word, his appearance disheveled, his suit jacket slung over one arm. His eyes were dark from lack of sleep, and he smelled faintly of the expensive hotel bar he often frequented when avoiding home. He didn't look at her straight away, instead pouring himself coffee with mechanical detachment, as if pretending that yesterday hadn't happened would somehow erase it. Eleanor remained calm, setting her cup down gently. "I wondered if you'd come back." He turned, finally meeting her gaze. "We need to talk." She gestured toward the conservatory. "Fine. In there." They sat across from each other, sunlight cutting through the glass roof and falling in sharp patterns across the tiled floor. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Thomas leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly. "What you did yesterday was calculated and cruel," he said flatly. "In front of my parents. The children. The entire family." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "And your announcement was what? Kind? Respectful? That's different." "I was being honest." "No," she replied coolly. "You were being performative. You wanted control of the story, of the sympathy. You didn't tell the truth, you told the version that would make you look like the victim of a civilized parting." Thomas's jaw clenched. "You embarrassed me." "No, Thomas. You embarrassed yourself. I merely stopped you from rewriting the facts." He stood suddenly, walking to the far end of the conservatory before spinning back. You blindsided me with those shares. Do you have any idea what you've done? Yes, she said. I protected myself. And your company. Though I doubt you'll thank me for either. His eyes narrowed. You think this makes you strong? Parading power like that? What are you planning, taking over my boardroom? Running the firm into the ground out of spite? Eleanor stood now, voice even but forceful. Spite would have meant going public with the state of your financials. Spite would have meant dragging you through the press, framing you as the husband who tried to discard his wife like a broken piece of furniture. But I didn't do that. You're threatening me now? No, she said, walking toward him. I'm reminding you. I'm not your enemy, Thomas. But you've made it abundantly clear you are not my partner. He looked genuinely rattled. This wasn't the Eleanor he'd grown used to, the one who accepted his long absences without complaint, who deferred to his business decisions, who stayed silent during his mood swings. This Eleanor met him word for word, step for step. And worse, she was calm. Completely in control. I don't know what's happened to you, he muttered. I stopped waiting for you to respect me, she replied. I built something while you were trying to dismantle us. He didn't respond. Instead, he walked back to the door and paused. This isn't over. She didn't flinch. No. It isn't. And with that, he left. In the days that followed, the tension spread like a shadow over everything. The children tiptoed around conversations, unsure how to react. Eleanor maintained routines as best she could, school runs, meals, updates on homework, but the undertone was undeniable. Charlotte called frequently, offering snippets of gossip from her office in gentle check-ins. Have you seen him since? She asked one afternoon. Briefly. It wasn't pleasant. I'm sure he's scrambling. You caught him off guard. Eleanor paused. He's planning something. I can feel it. And she was right. By midweek, Eleanor began receiving notifications from board members. Thomas had scheduled a strategic review meeting without consulting her. The phrasing was vague, but the timing unmistakable. He was attempting to regroup. Julian advised caution. He'll try to reframe your acquisition as hostile. Maybe even raise concerns about your lack of formal experience. He'll paint me as impulsive, she said. Exactly. So we counter that by being measured. You've got the majority stake, that's your power. But optics matter. Let them see you're not here to disrupt, but to stabilize. Eleanor prepared meticulously for the meeting. She reviewed the company's latest internal reports, drafted a list of talking points, and made sure every answer was backed by data. When the day came, she entered the boardroom not as a spouse with grievances, but as a leader with purpose. Thomas was already there, seated at the head of the long walnut table. Several executives glanced between them, their expressions guarded. Eleanor noted the subtle shift, where once they had barely acknowledged her, now they were studying her carefully. She took a seat directly opposite Thomas. The meeting began. As predicted, Thomas attempted to steer the conversation toward uncertainty. He suggested that the recent changes in shareholder structure were destabilizing and that a reassessment of leadership clarity was required. Eleanor responded only after he had finished. I agree, she said. Stability is crucial. Which is why I've brought with me a proposed outline for strengthening board communication, reviewing investor concerns, and rebuilding external confidence. She distributed neatly bound packets. Thomas blinked. I've also scheduled individual meetings with key department heads to ensure continuity. My presence here isn't to unsettle, it's to repair. The room remained silent. Then one board member, a veteran of the firm, cleared his throat. Well, that's the most preparation I've seen for a quarterly review in 5 years. Another added, it's refreshing, actually. Thomas didn't speak again until the meeting adjourned. As the others filed out, he lingered. Eleanor remained seated, organizing her notes. He stepped closer. This was always mine, he said quietly. And you made it vulnerable, she replied without looking up. I'm not taking anything from you, Thomas. I'm taking care of what you neglected. He stared at her for a long moment, then walked out. Eleanor waited until the door closed before exhaling. She wasn't naive. This wasn't victory. It was the beginning of a new phase. And the man behind the mask, who once wielded charm like a sword, was now exposed. Not broken, but cornered. And that was far more dangerous. Monday morning arrived with the kind of soft gray skies typical of a British spring, the sort that offered no hint of storm or sunshine. Eleanor stood before her wardrobe longer than usual, selecting a navy wool dress with clean lines and a structured collar. Professional, understated, but commanding. She paired it with low black heels and a camel coat. No excessive jewelry. No frills. Just precision. Her driver arrived promptly at 8 o'clock, and she stepped into the black car with her briefcase resting on her lap. She watched the Surrey countryside blur into the city skyline, her reflection steady in the glass. It was her first official board meeting as majority shareholder. Hughes Strategic Group's headquarters, an elegant glass and steel building in the heart of London's financial district, had always felt like a monument to Thomas's ambition. Eleanor had walked through its lobby countless times before, at events, fundraisers, end-of-year parties, always as a guest. Never as someone with authority. This time, she entered with her identification badge waiting at the front desk. The receptionist, a young woman with tightly pinned hair, smiled uncertainly. Mrs. Hughes. Welcome. Eleanor returned the smile, signed in, and took the lift to the top floor. As the doors opened, a secretary was already waiting. They're in the conference room, she said, then added in a lower voice, good luck. The boardroom was quieter than she'd expected when she entered. 12 people sat around the polished oak table. Coffee had been served. Notebooks were open. Some of the board members stood upon her arrival, others remained seated, watching her with curious expressions. Thomas was not yet present. Eleanor took her seat at the far end of the table, opposite the chairperson's usual position, a symbolic gesture, perhaps, but deliberate. She offered a cordial nod. Good morning. A few returned the greeting. One man, perhaps in his early 60s with silver hair and a stern face, spoke first. You'll be leading today's agenda? Yes, Eleanor replied. And thank you all for making time at short notice. I understand this transition has raised questions, and I'm here to clarify both my role and my intentions. Before she could continue, the door opened. Thomas entered, dressed immaculately as always, carrying a leather folio and a tight smile. Apologies, he said. Traffic. He didn't look at Eleanor as he took his seat halfway down the table. Eleanor began the meeting without hesitation. I'll begin by confirming that I now hold 52% of Hughes Strategic Group shares, as verified by corporate registry filings last week. I'm aware this development was unexpected, but it is both legal and binding. No one interrupted. She continued. My goal is not to upend the company. I've spent the last 2 months reviewing internal reports, project strategies, and investor feedback. My aim is to stabilize, not destabilize. The firm has potential, but it needs direction, calm, cohesive leadership with a long-term vision. I intend to provide that. A younger board member, dark-haired and wearing rimless glasses, leaned forward. And what exactly is your experience in executive management? Eleanor met his gaze evenly. Not formal. But I've spent the last 15 years managing complex operations, budgets, negotiations, crisis mitigation, and more recently, coordinating a multi-million-pound asset transfer with complete discretion. I've studied the firm's structure, engaged legal counsel, and met with key stakeholders. I'm not here as someone's wife. I'm here as the company's majority owner. There was a moment of silence, then murmurs passed between several members. One of the senior women on the board, Nicola Trenham, someone Eleanor recognized from years of social encounters, cleared her throat. We've worked with Thomas for years, she said. And though we've had challenges, no one expected this. The shift is jarring. But I'll admit, your preparation is impressive. Eleanor inclined her head. Thank you. I know trust is not given, it's earned. I'm not asking for allegiance today. I'm asking for collaboration. Let me show you that I take this role seriously. As the discussion progressed, Eleanor presented a series of proposals. Restructuring underperforming divisions. Implementing clearer reporting systems. Expanding internal audits. She spoke with clarity and control, avoiding emotional appeals. By the end of the meeting, several members had taken notes, nodded, or exchanged glances that suggested curiosity more than skepticism. Thomas, meanwhile, remained quiet. He watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. The meeting concluded without incident, and as the others filed out, Nicola approached Eleanor privately. He's not going to make this easy, she said quietly, nodding toward the now empty chair Thomas had occupied. I wouldn't expect him to, Eleanor replied. You should know, he's already been making calls. Trying to sow doubt. He's using words like emotional decision-making and personal vendetta. Eleanor nodded slowly. That doesn't surprise me. Just be prepared. Not all of the board are as open-minded as they appeared today. I am, Eleanor said. And thank you for your honesty. Later that afternoon, as she left the building, Eleanor's phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. Be careful who you trust. Some of them are already playing both sides. No name. No context. She forwarded the message to Julian, who promised to investigate. The rest of the day passed in a blur of emails, follow-up calls, and planning sessions. Back in Surrey that evening, the children were quiet at dinner. Alice offered a few guarded observations about school, while Henry kept his eyes on his plate. Afterwards, Eleanor found Alice in the study, scrolling through her phone. You were on the company website, Alice said without looking up. Your name's there now. Board of Directors. Eleanor smiled faintly. Yes. That's new. Alice set her phone down. Is it weird? Being there? Everyone's staring at you? It's unfamiliar, Eleanor said. But not uncomfortable. I think it's cool, Alice added, more softly. That you're doing this. Eleanor felt something settle in her chest, something warm, affirming. As the evening drew to a close, Eleanor sat on her bed with a folder of notes in her lap. There was still so much to do, so much to uncover. But today had been a beginning. She had entered the arena, where perception, politics, and precision shaped every move. And she wasn't leaving. The shift was subtle at first, barely detectable in the day-to-day rhythms of Hugh's strategic group. Projects delayed by a day or two. Emails left unanswered just long enough to stall momentum. Memos sent out with key details missing, forcing Eleanor to chase clarification. It wasn't sabotage in the dramatic sense, but it was intentional. Controlled. Surgical. And it had Thomas's signature all over it. The first real sign came during the launch of an internal audit initiative Eleanor had introduced to bring transparency to department-level expenditures. An innocuous process on the surface, standard practice in firms of that scale, but it had met with sudden, inexplicable resistance from the operations team. Eleanor was told the implementation lacked clarity, even though she had reviewed it line by line with legal and compliance. Julian, always composed, didn't mince words during their next call. He's interfering. Directly or through proxies. Eleanor sat at her desk, arms folded, staring at the flagged report on her screen. Can we prove it? Not yet. But he knows where the pressure points are. You're not dealing with open confrontation. You're dealing with erosion. She knew Julian was right. Thomas had been building his company for over a decade. He knew the habits, alliances, fears. He didn't need to launch a boardroom coup, he just needed to make Eleanor's leadership look ineffective. Within 2 weeks, productivity reports from 2 major departments showed an unexplained dip. A key staff member resigned with little notice. Morale, according to an HR Pulse survey, had declined slightly. Eleanor scheduled meetings with department heads, only to find herself rescheduled or stalled. Then came the press leak. A story appeared in a minor business blog with just enough reach to raise eyebrows. Hughes Strategic, a company in transition or in trouble? The article was vague, sourced anonymously, but hinted at internal tensions, power shifts, and concerns from longtime staff. Julian traced the source to a former contractor with ties to Thomas. "He's planting doubt," Julian said. "Carefully. A whisper campaign." Eleanor didn't flinch. Instead, she responded with strategy. She requested a company-wide town hall, her first since taking majority ownership, and insisted it be held live, with questions taken directly from staff, not filtered through management. Her team was nervous. "It's a risk," one of the communications advisors said. "If someone challenges you publicly, then I'll answer them publicly," Eleanor replied. "I'm not afraid of transparency." The town hall took place on a Friday morning. Over 200 staff logged into the live stream. Eleanor stood alone at a lectern in the central auditorium, no co-hosts, no flashy presentation, just her, a single camera, and the unfiltered gaze of the company. She began with honesty, acknowledging the shift in leadership, the natural uncertainty that followed, and the need for open dialogue. Then she laid out her vision: modernization, accountability, long-term growth, not at the expense of people, but because of them. Questions came in fast. Some were cautious, others pointed. "What qualifies you to lead without a corporate background?" "I understand what's at stake. And I'm building a team with the technical expertise where needed. My strength is recognizing what the company needs, and what it doesn't." "Are you planning to restructure senior management?" "I plan to review all performance objectively. There will be changes where necessary, but not based on loyalty, based on merit." Then came a question that felt like a test. "Is Mr. Hughes still involved in daily operations?" Eleanor paused for only a moment. "Thomas retains a senior position on paper. But operational authority rests with the board, and I will ensure decisions reflect the company's best interests, not any individual's preferences." It was a subtle line. A clear message. After the stream ended, several messages poured in, some from staff she'd never met. "Thank you for speaking directly. I've worked here for 6 years, and that's the first time anyone made the plan clear. Your leadership is refreshing. Keep going." A cautious win, but a win nonetheless. But Thomas wasn't done. 2 days later, she received an alert that a confidential planning document had been leaked. It wasn't publicly released yet, but an industry consultant she trusted reached out discreetly. "Check your marketing pipeline," he said. "Something's been exposed." Eleanor launched an internal inquiry through the compliance team. The results came back within 72 hours. The document had been accessed from Thomas's old assistant's login, an assistant who had been reassigned at Eleanor's request 2 weeks prior. It was a message. That evening, Eleanor confronted Thomas directly. She waited until he arrived at the office late in the day, likely assuming the floor was clear. She intercepted him outside the lift, clipboard in hand. "You leaked the campaign forecast," she said without raising her voice. He looked genuinely amused. "I think you'll find there's no proof of that." "I don't need proof to see a pattern." "You're paranoid," he said, stepping past her. "You're out of your depth and lashing out." Eleanor followed him down the corridor. "You're undermining the company to prove a point. And in doing so, you're proving mine." He stopped, turned to her with a smirk. "What point is that?" "That you never built this alone. You just made everyone think you did." They stared at each other in the half-lit corridor, the polished floors reflecting years of unspoken resentment. "Careful, Eleanor," he said quietly. "You think you're playing chess. But this isn't a board game." She didn't blink. "No. It's a company. One you're still trying to manipulate like a child with a broken toy." Thomas scoffed and walked off. But his stride wasn't as confident as it once was. The following morning, Eleanor received an unexpected request, a meeting with a major investor. Someone with a sizable, influential stake. Someone who had once been close to Thomas. And they wanted both of them present. Julian raised an eyebrow when she told him. "This is it," he said. "The real test." Eleanor sat back in her chair. "Then we'll give them a show." But not the one Thomas was hoping for. The room was stark but impressive, a private conference suite nestled within a sleek Mayfair office building. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city's skyline, though the light was muted behind a veil of light rain. Eleanor sat at one end of the polished mahogany table, her documents meticulously arranged, her expression calm but focused. Across from her sat Thomas, his usual polished confidence masked by a barely concealed tension. Between them, at the center, was the investor they had both come to impress. Lord Benjamin Cartwright was an imposing figure in his late 60s, a pillar of the British investment community known for his shrewd judgment and unyielding standards. His salt-and-pepper hair was impeccably groomed, and his sharp eyes scanned both Eleanor and Thomas like a chess master sizing up two worthy opponents. Despite his formal demeanor, there was an undercurrent of curiosity in his gaze. This meeting wasn't routine, it was pivotal. The atmosphere was charged, the stakes clear to everyone present. For months, rumors had circulated about the internal dynamics of Hughes' strategic group, and Benjamin's endorsement was now critical to cementing control. Thomas spoke first, launching into a carefully rehearsed critique. "Lord Cartwright, the recent changes in our leadership have introduced uncertainty at a critical time. Eleanor's acquisition was unexpected, to say the least. I worry that without clear, experienced leadership, the company risks losing its competitive edge." Eleanor listened intently, waiting until Thomas finished before responding. She spoke with measured confidence, articulating the reality behind the facade. "Lord Cartwright, my ownership is not a destabilizing force, it's a safeguard. Over the past 6 months, I have thoroughly reviewed Hughes Strategic Group's operations, financial health, and strategic positioning. I am committed to restoring stability and driving sustainable growth." Thomas smirked, preparing to interrupt, but Eleanor raised a hand, silently requesting the floor. "I understand your concerns about experience," she continued. "While my background is unconventional for a corporate leader, I have assembled a team of seasoned professionals and legal experts to ensure competent management. More importantly, I bring a fresh perspective unburdened by the inertia that sometimes afflicts established companies." Benjamin interjected, "Evidence is what I require. Words alone do not convince in matters of finance and governance." Eleanor nodded, sliding a folder across the table. "Here are detailed timelines of recent corporate decisions, financial reports, and a comprehensive risk assessment I commissioned. You'll see improvements in cash flow management and steps taken to address prior governance gaps. Furthermore, I have prepared a plan outlining the next phases of strategic initiatives aimed at market expansion and internal restructuring." Benjamin opened the folder, browsed through pages with practiced efficiency. Thomas watched nervously, a rare crease forming between his brows. "I also want to address recent attempts to undermine leadership," Eleanor said quietly. "There have been leaks, misinformation, and intentional delays within project teams. These acts threaten not only the company's reputation but also investor confidence." Thomas shot her a glare but remained silent. Benjamin's eyes lifted from the documents. "Do you have proof of these claims?" Eleanor produced another set of documents, emails, and internal audit reports flagged for investigation. These items, along with IT security logs, implicate individuals connected to Mr. Hughes's former team. Thomas's composure cracked momentarily. "You're twisting facts. Or you're avoiding responsibility," Eleanor countered. Benjamin sat back, steepling his fingers. "Impressive. The depth of your preparation is evident. Yet, the question remains, can you unite the board and lead effectively in this turbulent period?" Eleanor met his gaze directly. "I am prepared to do whatever it takes. I am not here for symbolic ownership, I am here to lead." There was a pause as Benjamin absorbed her words. "I must admit, "Mrs. Hughes, this is more than I expected," he said finally. "Your approach is methodical and clear. However, leadership is as much about managing people as managing reports. Are you ready for that challenge?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "More than ever." Thomas shifted uncomfortably but made no reply. The meeting shifted into a discussion of future plans, market diversification, technological innovation, talent retention. Eleanor spoke fluidly, referencing recent consultations and feedback from department heads. Thomas interjected sporadically, attempting to cast doubt, but Eleanor met each point with calm facts and direct responses. When the session ended, Benjamin turned to both. "I will support Mrs. Hughes's leadership, provided she continues to demonstrate the competence and resolve you've shown today." Thomas's face paled. The message was clear, his influence was waning. Outside the conference room, Eleanor exhaled deeply. Julian, waiting nearby, smiled. "That was a masterclass," he said. "You dismantled his arguments without raising your voice." Eleanor nodded. "This is far from over." Indeed, as they parted ways, Thomas's parting words echoed ominously. "This isn't over." Eleanor knew he was right. But for the first time, she felt she had the upper hand. Benjamin's endorsement meant more than just investor confidence. It was a public signal to the company and market that her leadership was legitimate, unassailable. Walking to the car, Eleanor felt a quiet satisfaction. The battle was intensifying, but the tide was turning. She wasn't just fighting for control, she was fighting to rebuild. And this meeting was the moment everything shifted. The calm that had settled after Lord Cartwright's endorsement was deceptive, a fragile veneer masking a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. Eleanor knew better than to trust it. Thomas had been patient, measured, and calculated throughout this battle, and he was far from done. Late one Tuesday evening, Eleanor sat in her study, reviewing the latest quarterly projections, when her phone buzzed. The screen flashed an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Mrs. Hughes?" The voice was clipped, cautious. "Yes," Eleanor replied. "Who is this?" "My name is Mark Finley. I used to work at Hughes Strategic, until recently." Eleanor's brow furrowed. "How can I help you, Mr. Finley?" "I have information that you might want to hear, something about Thomas's latest move. A potential buyback of shares. But it's under the radar." Eleanor's heart quickened. "Go on." Finley explained that Thomas was attempting to regain control of Hughes Strategic Group by orchestrating a secretive purchase of shares through an international proxy. The plan involved channeling funds through a series of offshore accounts and investment firms, with the goal of acquiring enough voting shares to override Eleanor's majority. "This isn't public yet," Finley warned. "Only a few people are in on it. But the deadline is tight, less than 48 hours to close the deal." Eleanor swallowed, already calculating the implications. If Thomas succeeded, she risked losing control entirely. "Do you have proof?" she asked. Finley promised to send what he had: emails, transaction records, coded messages, all linked to the proxy firms. Within the hour, the documents arrived. Julian was already reviewing them when Eleanor forwarded the information. "Thomas is playing a dangerous game," Julian said, eyes scanning the files. "This kind of buyback attempt is complex but not impossible to block if we move quickly." "Then we need to act," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "What's our first step?" Julian outlined the plan. They needed to identify the key regulatory and legal checkpoints that the transaction required, alert the relevant authorities, and secure any missing documentation that could invalidate or delay the buyback. Time was the critical factor. Eleanor moved swiftly. She contacted the company's legal counsel and compliance team, instructing them to prepare urgent filings opposing the transaction on grounds of non-disclosure and procedural irregularities. Simultaneously, she reached out to trusted contacts within the financial regulatory bodies, briefing them on the covert operation. But as they worked, a new obstacle emerged. One essential document, a shareholder consent form, was missing from their records. Without it, the legal team warned, they risked the buyback proceeding unchallenged. Eleanor's mind raced. The document should have been among the contracts she had acquired during her share purchases. Its absence was alarming. Julian suggested they track its paper trail, querying the company's archives, liaising with third-party custodians, and even contacting former executives who might have access. Hours became a blur of phone calls, emails, and meetings. Eleanor barely slept. Her family noticed her exhaustion but said little. The children offered quiet support, sensing the gravity of the situation but unsure how to intervene. Midway through the ordeal, Eleanor received a cryptic message from an anonymous source: "Check the old legal vault. Not everything is where it should be." The old legal vault was a forgotten filing system maintained by a legacy law firm that had handled Hughes Strategic's early contracts. Eleanor instructed Julian to dispatch a team immediately. Meanwhile, Thomas remained conspicuously absent from public view. Rumors swirled that he was lobbying powerful investors, trying to secure personal loans to fund the buyback. Yet, he made no direct contact with Eleanor, as if taunting her from the shadows. The final hours before the buyback deadline were tense. Julian's team discovered that the missing document had been misfiled, a technicality but one that jeopardized the proxy's legitimacy. With that discovery, the legal team filed an injunction, halting the transaction just hours before closure. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. The immediate threat was neutralized. Yet, she knew this wasn't the end. Thomas's tactics had escalated beyond simple boardroom maneuvers. He was desperate, dangerous. But Eleanor was ready. She had navigated the storm and held firm. And now, with the legal victory behind her, she was poised to secure Hughes Strategic Group's future on her terms. The victory over Thomas's buyback attempt felt like a turning point, but Eleanor knew it was merely one battle in a far larger war. In the weeks that followed, her focus shifted from immediate defense to deeper investigation. She needed to understand the true state of Hughes Strategic Group, the company she now controlled and was determined to save. Julian's team worked tirelessly, digging through financial statements, audit reports, and internal communications. What they uncovered was both alarming and enlightening. The company had been on the brink of collapse long before Eleanor's involvement. Several months prior to her share acquisitions, the financial health of Hughes Strategic Group had been deteriorating rapidly. Liquidity problems had forced the postponement of key projects. Suppliers had grown wary, demanding stricter payment terms. Major clients had expressed concern over delays and quality control. Yet none of this had been disclosed fully to the board or investors. Thomas had been orchestrating a facade of success, commissioning overly optimistic forecasts, masking deficits with short-term loans, and delaying critical maintenance on infrastructure. His charm and reputation had bought time, but the cracks were widening. Eleanor felt a mix of betrayal and grim resolve as she reviewed the reports. This wasn't just a company in transition, it was a company in crisis, held together by smoke and mirrors. One particularly damning document was a confidential internal memo marked urgent, dated weeks before her share purchase completion. It detailed how a failed international partnership had resulted in a potential loss exceeding £10 million, information withheld from shareholders and the board alike. Eleanor called a private meeting with the current board members, including Nicola Trenum and others who had been cautiously supportive. She presented the findings with clinical clarity, her voice steady despite the weight of the revelations. "This is the reality we inherited," she said. "Not a failing business caused by transition, but a failing business hidden by years of mismanagement." The room was silent. Nicola finally spoke, voice low but firm. "If this is true, it explains so much. The sudden need for liquidity, the internal resistance. Thomas has been covering his tracks." Eleanor nodded. "More than covering. He actively suppressed information and misled both us and our investors." The implications were profound. Not only was Thomas's departure necessary for the company's survival, but the board now had the evidence required to take formal action. Over the next days, Eleanor coordinated with legal counsel to prepare a detailed report for submission to the board and regulatory authorities. She met privately with key stakeholders, reassuring them of the company's new direction and her commitment to transparency. Throughout this process, Eleanor's children noticed a subtle change in her. There was a renewed strength, a fierceness tempered with purpose. Alice approached her one afternoon while she worked in the study. "Is it true what they're saying about Dad's company?" Alice asked softly. Eleanor looked at her daughter, seeing both concern and growing maturity in her eyes. "It's true that things weren't as they seemed. But we're fixing it." Alice nodded, then added, "I'm proud of you, Mom." Those words echoed in Eleanor's mind during long nights of review and planning. The company's auditors were brought in to conduct a full forensic investigation, uncovering further discrepancies and leading to the discovery of several breaches of fiduciary duty. Thomas's empire, once thought impregnable, was revealed to be fragile and flawed. Eleanor now held the power not only to steer the company back to health but also to protect it from future shadows. The board moved swiftly. Armed with overwhelming evidence, they voted unanimously to remove Thomas from all roles within Hughes Strategic Group, barring him from any future involvement. Thomas pleaded, argued, and attempted charm offensive efforts, but the tide had turned. Eleanor was not merely the shareholder who had challenged him, she was the steward of a legacy that needed salvation. And she was determined to deliver it. As the news spread throughout the company and financial markets, Eleanor took a moment alone in her office, gazing out over the London skyline. The truth behind the collapse had been harsh, but necessary. And now, with the past laid bare, Hughes Strategic Group had a chance to rebuild. Not on illusions, but on integrity. The boardroom was colder than usual that morning, the polished glass walls reflecting the stark reality within. Eleanor arrived early, dressed sharply in charcoal gray, a statement of authority and purpose. The room had been prepared for a meeting unlike any before. Chairs were arranged in a semicircle, the usual formalities replaced by a palpable tension that even the seasoned corporate assistants found unsettling. Thomas entered shortly after, his expression a mask of forced calm. The months since his ousting had been bruising, his empire slipping through his fingers, his reputation tarnished, and his influence waning. Yet, there was a glimmer of the old Thomas in his eyes, a man who refused to accept defeat. Eleanor stood at the head of the table, documents and evidence arrayed before her like a carefully laid battlefield. She addressed the assembled board and legal representatives with steady confidence. Today marks the conclusion of a difficult chapter for Hughes Strategic Group. We have reviewed exhaustive evidence detailing financial misconduct, breaches of fiduciary duty, and intentional misinformation within our company's operations. These actions have jeopardized our business, our employees, and our investors. She paused, meeting each face in the room. The individual responsible for these breaches is Mr. Thomas Hughes. As such, the board has moved to remove him permanently from any executive or advisory role within the company. Thomas shifted in his seat, his voice low but edged with desperation. "I have devoted my life to this company. You all know that. I never intended to harm it." Eleanor's eyes sharpened. "Intentions aside, the consequences of your actions are clear. The board and I have a duty to protect this company from further harm." He stood, pacing slowly. "You think this is the end? You think you've won? The company was built on my vision and my drive. Your vision has been clouded by poor decisions and secrecy," Eleanor replied firmly. "The drive you once had was buried beneath evasions and falsehoods. We are rebuilding that vision on transparency and integrity." Thomas's voice rose slightly. "You're rewriting history. You were always in my shadow, an accessory to my success. Now you think you can run the show?" "I am running the show," Eleanor said without hesitation. "Because I believe in this company and in the people who work here. Not in maintaining a facade." He stepped closer to her, voice lowering to a threat. "You may have control now, but remember, this isn't personal. It's business. And business can be ruthless." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "So am I." The board exchanged glances, some nodding subtly, others stiffening with resolve. One of the legal counsel interjected, "Mr. Hughes, the board's decision is final. Any attempt to interfere will be met with appropriate legal action." Thomas's shoulders sagged, a flicker of defeat passing over his face. He glanced around the room, then back at Eleanor. "This isn't the last you'll see of me," he said quietly. Eleanor allowed herself a brief, cold smile. "I'm sure it isn't. But today, you leave as a former executive. And I suggest you prepare for what comes next." As Thomas exited the boardroom, the atmosphere shifted. The weight of closure settled over the remaining members. Eleanor remained standing, gathering her documents with deliberate calm. She turned to the board, her voice resolute. "Our focus now must be on healing, repairing relationships within the company, restoring investor confidence, and setting a course for sustainable growth." Nicola Trenholm stepped forward, voice warm but determined. "We stand with you, Eleanor. This is a new beginning." Over the following days, Eleanor met with employees, investors, and partners. Her message was consistent: acknowledgement of past failings, commitment to transparency, and a clear vision for the future. The media caught wind of the board's decisive action. Headlines praised the firm's renewed leadership and condemned the previous mismanagement. For the first time in months, Hughes Strategic Group's name was associated with hope rather than scandal. At home, Eleanor found solace in her family's quiet support. Alice and Henry, though still adjusting, expressed pride in their mother's strength and integrity. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Eleanor sat with Charlotte over tea. "You handled that confrontation like a pro," Charlotte said, shaking her head in admiration. "It had to be done," Eleanor replied. "For the company. For myself. For the family." Charlotte smiled. "You've redefined yourself on your own terms. Not just as someone's wife, but as a leader." Eleanor looked out the window at the fading light. There's still a long road ahead. But for the first time, it feels like we're moving forward. And with that, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The final confrontation had closed one door, but another had opened. The future was hers to shape. Months had passed since the final confrontation in the boardroom, and Eleanor Hughes had begun to carve out a new reality, for herself, for her family, and for Hughes Strategic Group. The company, once teetering on the edge of collapse, now breathed with cautious optimism under her steady guidance. The halls that had echoed with uncertainty were beginning to hum with renewed purpose. Eleanor's office reflected this transformation. Gone were the sharp edges and rigid austerity of her early days as majority shareholder. In their place stood shelves lined with books on leadership, innovation, and corporate social responsibility. Plants thrived on the windowsill, casting a soft green light across her polished desk. Photos of her children, Alice and Henry, smiled back at her, a reminder of the life she was fighting to secure. Today was different. She was not at the office preparing for a board meeting or a crisis briefing. Instead, Eleanor stood before a modest gathering in a sunlit conference room on the lower floor, a room set aside for a new initiative that symbolized more than just corporate strategy. It was the launch of Hughes Strategic's Women in Business Mentorship Program, a project Eleanor had championed from inception. The room filled with women from across the company, junior analysts, mid-level managers, executives, each eager to hear Eleanor speak. She surveyed their faces with genuine warmth. This was the legacy she wanted to build. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice steady and clear. "When I stepped into this role, I knew the path ahead would be challenging. But I also knew that leadership isn't just about profits or market share, it's about people. It's about creating opportunities, fostering growth, and empowering the next generation." She paused, letting her words sink in. This mentorship program is designed to do just that. To provide support, guidance, and a network for women in our industry who face unique challenges and opportunities. We want to nurture talent, encourage ambition, and ensure that every voice is heard. Applause filled the room. Eleanor smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. Later, as the event wrapped up, Nicola Trenholm approached her. "You've really made a difference, Eleanor. The company culture is shifting. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. It's only the beginning. We have to keep building on this momentum. The afternoon sun filtered through the windows as Eleanor stepped outside, breathing in the fresh air. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from an unknown sender. She hesitated before opening it. The text read, "You were never supposed to win. And yet, you did." Eleanor's lips curled into a faint smile. There was no signature. No indication of who had sent it. But the words resonated deeply. She tucked the phone away and looked up at the sky, the clouds parting to reveal a patch of clear blue. At home that evening, Eleanor gathered her family for dinner. The atmosphere was relaxed, the tension that had once gripped their household replaced by a newfound sense of peace. Alice shared stories from school, Henry talked about a new project, and Charlotte joined via video call, her laughter filling the room. After the meal, Eleanor sat by the fireplace, reflecting on how far she had come. The journey had been arduous, fraught with betrayal, struggle, and uncertainty. But it had also been transformative. She had reclaimed her identity, not as the wife of a man whose ambition had overshadowed her own, but as a leader, a mother, a woman who had fought for her place in the world and won. Tomorrow, the work would continue. There would be challenges, decisions to make, and new battles to face. But Eleanor was ready. Because this time, she was building her future on her terms. And that made all the difference.